guideline number 3 in the official TED Talk content guidelines says no religious proselytizing. I get that. I think it's a legitimate reason. That's not why we have TED Talks. I understand that guideline. I intend to abide by that guideline. But I'm also going to tell you a Bible story. This is my favorite Bible story. It comes from the first 8 verses of the 19th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." That's the whole story. It's a great story. I told you that story because I think it's a really good story about including someone who has been marginalized and prevented from participating in a particular community. So I'm going to tell the story again, but this time I invite you to hear the story as a story about inclusion. Verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. This is a helpful way to begin the story because it suggests to us that this particular story that we're talking about now is part of a much bigger story. There's more going on than just the specific thing we're talking about here in chapter 19. So Jesus entered Jericho and he was passing through it. There's also motion in this story. There's stuff going on. It's a dynamic story. Things are happening that day there in Jericho. Verse 2, a man was there named Zacchaeus. He was chief tax collector and was rich. So now in verse 2, the narrator introduces us to this new character, Zacchaeus, and he immediately tells us 2 categories that Zacchaeus fits into. He says he's chief tax collector and he's rich. Well, if we were a first century audience hearing this story for the first time or reading this story for the first time, we would have learned a lot about Zacchaeus based just on that description. We would have known that anybody in Jericho in the first century who was a tax collector would have been working for the Roman Empire, would have been working for the army that was occupying Judea at that time. That's the way the Romans worked. The Romans needed money to fund their empire, and part of the way they raised money was by levying taxes among the people in the areas that they'd conquered. So what they do is find willing individuals in those areas and make them tax collectors. They'd set them up and say, "Okay, you're going to owe us a certain amount of money every year per person in your area. And we're going to use our army to back you up as you try to get taxes that we're levying. And if you want to collect a little bit more than what you're going to owe to us, that's fine. We'll back you up that way. Our army will still back you up." And that's how you got to be a rich tax collector in first century Judea, by collecting more money from your neighbors than you owed to the Romans. And any first century audience would have known this about Zacchaeus just by this verse 2 in this story. So already at the end of verse 2, Zacchaeus is going to be an unpopular guy. Nobody's going to like him. They all recognize that this guy is a lousy, stinking sinner. Verse 3, but this lousy, stinking sinner, he was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. It's an interesting twist in the story. Maybe a little bit of sympathetic treatment of Zacchaeus. He's at least interested in seeing who Jesus is. That maybe is a little bit of surprise, but we learned that that's what he wants to do, but he's having trouble. The reason he's having trouble is because he's vertically challenged. And so he's here, he's trying to see Jesus, but apparently all of his tacky neighbors that don't really like him, they're not going to move over so that the short guy can see. So now we've learned 3 categories here by the end of verse 3. We have learned already about Zacchaeus that he's chief tax collector and he's rich, and we know what that means. And we've also learned that he's short in stature. So that's where we are at the end of verse 3. We go to verse 4. Zacchaeus ran ahead and climbed a tree so he could see him because he knew he was going to pass that way. So Zacchaeus, who can't get his neighbors to move over so he can see, tries to take steps. He runs ahead to this place where he knows Jesus is going to go. He climbs up in the tree. He's just trying to see Jesus. He's just trying to access that story, that narrative that's taking place in Jericho. So my whole point today depends on our understanding right here at the end of verse 4, that when verse 4 ends, Zacchaeus is a marginalized person. It's hard maybe to think about the rich guy being marginalized. It's hard to think sometimes about an agent of the government being marginalized. But in the particular context of this story, the way Luke tells us this story, we need to understand at the end of verse 4 that Zacchaeus is marginalized. He is being prevented from being a full participant in the community that he's part of. And the reason that's important is because Jesus is going to do something in verse 5 that I think has great value for any of us who are interested in including marginalized persons in our particular contexts. Verse 5. When he came to the place, Jesus looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." That's the whole verse. But look at all that's going on in that verse. When he came to the place, Jesus looked up. That's very important. Jesus is not just focused on the road in front of him. He's not checking his messages. He's not marking stuff off of his to-do list. He's not just staring at the road in front of him and listening to a podcast on his earbuds. Jesus, as he's going along, looks up. He looks around. He recognizes what's going on in his environment. And this is a great lesson for all of us who are interested in including marginalized persons in our own context. Part of what we learned from this story is that sometimes marginalization is obvious. It takes place right in our faces, but not always. Sometimes instances of exclusion and marginalization are going on the periphery. We who are interested in including marginalized persons need to be diligent about watching for instances of marginalization and exclusion. We need to follow Jesus' lead and look up and look around. Next thing that happens in verse 5, Jesus comes to the place, he looked up, and he said to him, "Zacchaeus." That's huge. Jesus gets to the place, he looks up, and then he calls Zacchaeus by his name. He does not look up in that tree and say, "Yo, Pee-wee." He doesn't look up and grin and sing a couple of verses of the Beatles' Taxman song. Jesus gets to this place, he looks around, he looks up and looks around, he knows what's going on, and then he calls Zacchaeus by his name. He does not treat him in the categories that we already know that he's a representative of. Similarly, the lesson that we need to learn is that we need to be diligent about not treating people just as generic representatives of categories. We need to remember that everybody is a whole person with a whole name. Now, categories are fine. Categories are good sometimes. Our brains, all the time, we like to take information, gather it together, put it in patterns and orders. That's helpful because it keeps us from having to think about everything at once. Categories are fine. But we have to be careful about drawing generalizations and conclusions about individual people just based on the categories that they fit into. Tom Cruise and I are 2 white men who were born within 120 days of each other in 1962. Knowing that doesn't tell you very much about him or about me. But cut him some slack, he's doing the best he can. So Jesus comes to the place. He looks up. He calls Zacchaeus by name. He says to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So after he gets to the place, after he looks up and recognizes the guy in the tree, After he calls him by his name and doesn't just treat him as a generic representative of categories, the next thing Jesus does in this verse is invite Zacchaeus to come down out of the audience and get into the story. He looks up and invites him to come down and play a particular role, to come down and share a gift that only he can share in this story. Again, I hope this is an obvious lesson for all of us who are interested in including marginalized persons. Not only do we need to look up and look around, not only do we need to call people by names, recognize that everybody is a whole person with a whole name, but we also need to be about inviting the marginalized persons that we encounter, invite them to come out of the audience and to take their place in the story, inviting them to identify and share the particular gifts that they have to share in our larger common narrative. So Jesus does those three excellent things in verse 5. Jesus looks up, he calls Zacchaeus by his name, and he invites him to share his gifts. Verse 6, so Zacchaeus came down and was happy to welcome him. Zacchaeus is excited. Jesus stops and he looks up and Zacchaeus is ready. Jesus stops, he looks up, he calls him by his name, he says, hurry, come down, and immediately Zacchaeus comes running down. He is ready for this opportunity that he has to play his role in this story. So Jesus hurried down, and he was happy to welcome him. It feels really good to be noticed and to be addressed by name and to be invited out of the audience and into the story, to be invited to share your gifts. Makes sense. Zacchaeus is loving this in verse 6. The tacky neighbors have a different idea. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. This is Zacchaeus' neighbors trying to put him back into the categories that they've used to limit him this whole time. They're resisting this notion that Zacchaeus is anybody other than who they already had decided he was a long time ago. I did some research getting ready for this talk, and I came across a particular phrase in my research that I think is helpful for us as we try to understand exactly what's going on here in verse 6. So based on my extensive research, I think the best conclusion related to this verse 7 is, haters gonna hate. It's important for us. Sometimes when we are in the business, sometimes when we are trying to be diligent about including marginalized people in our own context, others are going to push back against us. Others are going to try to put people back into the situations that marginalized them in the first place. Okay, so that's going to happen. That shouldn't stop the important work that we have of including marginalized persons. Haters going to hate. We got work to do. It doesn't matter. Verse 8. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. That's the end of the story. This is Zacchaeus at the end of the story saying, okay, I get it. I'm going to share my stuff. I'm going to clean up the messes that I've made. But it's important for us to understand in this story that Zacchaeus doesn't do this so that Jesus or anybody else will notice him or call him by his name or invite him into the story. All those things have already happened back in verse 5. Zacchaeus is vowing to be a happy, generous, full participant in the community in response to the experience that he's already had of being identified and addressed by name and invited into the story. Again, I think this is a huge lesson for all of us who are interested in including marginalized persons. Zacchaeus was a marginalized person at the end of verse 4. Nobody would move over so he could even see. Here now in verse 8, he is a full, happy, generous participant in the story. And the difference, the change in the story is what happened in verse 5. We need to remember the lessons that we learned from Jesus' behavior in verse 5. Jesus looked up, he called Zacchaeus by name, and he invited him to share his gifts. Seems to me that we can all take that away from this story. We're all, in all of our efforts to include marginalized persons in our own context, we also can and should look up and know names and call forth gifts. Let's do that. Thank you.